I'm doing a review here of an older rum that I had reviewed back in 2019 or thereabouts. And I remember being that enthusiastic about it, at least about the experience in which I tried it, that I wrote 3,000 words on a rum where the rum review itself was only like about, 10-15% of it. But I have to kind of like tell the story to put things into the perspective of how it was at that time in that place, which is something really quite seminal in its own way. Not because the rum was particularly new or took us in new directions or anything like that. Nothing of the sort. No. It was simply different. And now I have a large sample of the thing here, which I'm going to try as I go through this, but I want to tell the story and relate something of what it was like. Now, this was done in about March of 2019 at the Paris Rum Fest, and all of us were meeting at the Maria Loca bar in Paris. And like those tiny Caribbean islands that you might occasionally fly over if you're visiting the place, that cocktail bar is so tiny and has such a small storefront that if you were to sneeze and blink, you'd go straight past it. So when Mrs. Kaner and I went inside, it was dark, it was hectic, it was noisy, and the place was going great guns. And at the bar, along with two other guys, Guillaume Leblanc, who was a friend of mine I'd had dinner with the previous night, was making daiquiris with flair and fine style, greeting old customers and barflies and Rumfest attendees, and the shaker was never still. And even though he no longer works there, I think he's currently in Réunion, at that time he seemed to know just about everybody by their first name, which to me kind of makes him a top-notch bartender, even without the acrobatic or mixing skills. Okay, but off in the corner, off to the side, were Joshua Singh and Gregors Nielsen. They repped 1423 at that time, and they had a quartet of bottles in front of them. Part of the reason that they were there was to demonstrate the single barrel selection of their Danish company named 1423, which, for those who know, is named after the first barrel of rum that they ever bottled back in 2008. They wanted to demonstrate how these four rums fared in cocktails, which is part of why Guillaume was there too. So there was a Nikolai Walkman, a friend of mine from Denmark, and he and Mrs. Kaner were drafted to help out and kind of like do stuff. And, like I was wedged in there in the side with my little notebook trying to do my review things. And, I had the little black book, something like this, since the big black book just didn't fit in my pocket and I was going to go schlepping it around Paris that day, right? 3 of the bottles that we had of the 4 were formal releases by the SBS range of 1423, and there was a Jamaican, there was a Trini, and there was one from Mauritius. The 4th was a White Lightning tester from Ghana. At the time, 1423 had the thing to distribute the Ghanaian rum from what was then the Mim distillery. And at the time, forget that part, but I just didn't have a clue which one to start with. Now, Nikolai had 4 glasses in front of him, and somebody seemed to be sipping from all 4 at once, so he was no help. And, Mrs. Kaner, she was sampling the first of what would be many daiquiris that evening. And usually she has this really fierce thing in her eye for quality rums, but she was just admiring Guillaume's smooth drink-making technique while, batting her eyes a little bit too much in his direction for my peace of mind. But you know what? He's engaged to a very fine, fetching young miss of his own, so I don't really worry too much. Anyway, so I hopped across to Joshua, who was happily pouring shots for the curious and talking on background about the rums, with that air of an avuncular off-season Santa Claus. Any recommendations, I asked him. And to be honest with you, how he could talk to me, pour precisely into his small glasses, have an occasional sip of his own, discuss technical stuff, and call out hellos to all the people in the crowd all at once is a mystery. But maybe he's just a better multitasker than I am. I'm just going to pour this just to get things started off. All right, so Joshua looked back at me and said, you know what? Try the Jamaican. And he disappeared behind the bar. And I was kind of curious. I said, well, what, not the Trinidadian? But he came back to my side of the bar with, 2 new daiquiris in his hand. And it's like, what was happening? Mrs. Kaner grabbed one immediately. She fended off Nikolai's eager hands and he just shoved it into the wall. And he's looking at me with this dirty look like this is all my fault. Anyway, so Joshua says, well, it's not a Coroni. so you may feel let down. That was his opinion, I thought. And he handed me a second cocktail glass. Oh, sorry, he handed a second cocktail glass to another customer and started pouring yet a third. Lance, it's Angostura and you're a rum dork. You might not want to start with that. And, he kind of like give me that shit-eating grin and, okay. Now, since I was writing at the time an on again, off again survey of rums from Africa, 50 words and I was all done. The Ghanaian white rum really piqued my interest, and I turned to Gregors, who is as tidy and in control as ever, and still has no friends, And he was one of those guys who I just loved to pieces. I mean, I suspect he kind of lined up all of his pencils and his papers at the edge of his desk in school. And I said to him, "Okay, well, what do you think? The Ghana, you think?" And he thought about it for a moment, and then he shook his head and poured me a really delicate, neat shot of the Mauritius 2008, which is, well, this one, all right? You better start with this one, son. It's a bit more mellow. And anyway, you tried the Ghana last year in Berlin, so if you need it, you can try it again later. Why repeat the experience? Only a fool climbs Mount Fuji twice, right? So the rum, this one, winked really invitingly at me. So I took a few moments, took a few pictures of the bottle, and I thought again, as I usually do when I see this kind of thing, is how far labels have come in the last decade. Because Velia started the trend, yes, sure, absolutely, but there were others around, of course, who had informative labels of their own. The Compagnie des Indes provided great levels of detail. Renaissance, of course, is the poster child for this thing. But what I saw in this particular one was quietly amazing. So the label noted the distillery, which was Gray's, which is a famed family name as well. They also make the New Grove and the Lazy Dodo type of rums, but not the St. Albans. And the source, which in this case is molasses, the still type column, distillation date 2008, bottling date 2018, and other throwaway details such as the non-chill filtration, the port wine finish, very important, the 281 bottle outturn, and the 55.7% ABV strength. I mean, you really couldn't ask for more than that, and I was really quite grateful. All right, so I knows this here. And at the time, I remember what it was like. My eyes just widened. Wow, this thing is good. It smells of Toblerone, white chocolate, vanilla, almonds, but they were also lighter and more chirpy notes swirling around that. Gooseberries, ginger shavings, green grapes, apples. And behind that, there were aromas of dark fruit like plums, prunes, dates, together with some vague red wine notes, probably from the finish. It really had a really good balance. It was musky, earthy smells mixing together with lighter and dark fruits, a really good amalgam. And you'd never confuse this with a Guyanese or a Jamaican or a Caroni or a French island agricole. So I kind of glanced over at Mrs. Kana to get a second opinion, but she was ogling some glass flipping thing that freaking Guillaume was doing. And so I asked Nikolai what he thought, and he checked glass number 2 on his table. And he said, yeah, no, absolutely a highly impressive dram, just different enough from the others to be really interesting in its own way. I mean, he loved the way the finish added to the overall effect, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, it really was quite nice. So as I was scribbling my notes into the little black book, I asked Gregors kind of slyly, so is there anything that you've been told not to tell me about this rum? Because, I mean, the man's like my brother, but, business and blood don't always mix well. Trust is earned and not given freely, and I'm curious about how he's going to answer. And Nikolai kind of over here, his ears are going up, and he perked up and he paused with his nose hanging over the third glass in his range. And he said, and though he doesn't talk much, you got to understand this about Nick. His curiosity and rum knowledge were the equal of my own, and he likes knowing these niggly little details too. So anyway, Gregor said to me, well, no. Everything you want to know is there. But if you have any questions, we will answer. Gregor's is just like that kind of guy. And he and Joshua are exchanging in really amused looks. And truth to tell, the things that I'm looking for are the two omissions that only a super rum dork would ask for or actively seek out. So I wonder whether he was thinking the same thing. But whatever. I asked the usual questions. Are there any additives? You didn't mention anything on the label, so you got anything to say about that? And of course, this is important, right? Because given how central such a declaration in these days to new companies who want to establish their honesty and street cred, it's an odd thing to not put on the label, at least in my opinion. And I wanted to know why. So Joshua, he didn't miss a beat. He confirmed that there was no additives in this thing. It was part of the ethos of the entire single barrel selection line of rums. It was not considered to be necessary on the label because of that. But he kind of had a little weasel note there because he figured out that if some weird older gunk from Panama or Guyana or wherever was put in were to be bottled and then found to be doctored by the original producer, say with caramel or whatever it is, then 1423 would have egg all over its face, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. But before I asked, he and Gregors told me that this rum, this Mauritius piece that I've got in front of me, wasn't from a single barrel, but several casks that were blended together. And I did actually, in my written review, provide a ton of notes on exactly how that was accomplished, but it's really too much for a review that is already going to go on quite long. All right, so while I'm scribbling all of this down, and while I'm taking my nosing notes and God knows what else, and kind of paying attention to Mrs. Kane, who was still looking at Guyana a little bit too much, that bar was getting noisier and more crowded as people from all over the rum world started to come together. And this is the part where things started to get really fun, because Pete Holland of the Floating Rum Shack just turned up, and he was making the rounds, pressing the flesh, because he knows just like about everybody. Although his pretty wife was nowhere in sight, which is kind of a shame. Yoshi Takeuchi of Nine Leaves was center court on the table. He was like 3 sheets to the wind, telling a hilarious R-rated story about how... I can't really tell you all about it here, much as I'd like to, but it was basically about how he was mugged in Marseille on a rum show while taking a leak in an alleyway. You know, it's just like, you just can't make this shit up. You know, and Florent Boucher of a Compagnie des Indes, he was mingling. He and I go back away, so I shouted a hello at him over the thing. I said hello to the cheerfully bearded and smiling Ingvar Rum Thompson, who was basically the journalist and elder statements of the Danish rum scene, and he was hanging out next to his physically polar opposite, the tall, slim, clean-shaven Johnny Dreyer, who was, of course, famous for his the sugar work that he did back in 2014. So Johnny and I, sharing this one interest, we briefly discussed the new camera that I'd helped him to buy and some of his photographs and the state of the rumiverse in general. And you know what? They were probably brand reps and other French rumistas in attendance, but I didn't really recognize anybody else. And the ones that I was looking for, which was Jazz and Indie Sing, they weren't there. But you know what? Everybody was enjoying themselves thoroughly. The music was loud, the people were fun, and the energy level of the bar was simply off the scale. All right, so Guillaume finished his cocktail twirling demo and lost my wife's attention, thank God. So I note that with real happiness, right? So he was mixing more drinks for another small group of people who just wandered in. And Mrs. Kaner, she started talking to Nikolai about his marital status and that of her entire tribe of single female relatives, And I guess that after landing me like a prize trout all these many years ago, my pretty little wife had developed a raging desire to help out any single person of marriageable age. And she's seen Hitch like 47 times, which really doesn't help. Anyway, they were both ignoring the rums in front of them, so I just kind of like, oh, for God's sake, rolled my eyes at all this blasphemy and continued on to the tasting. Wow, I do like that. Let me tell you, even now, years later, tasting it again, back then I remember thinking that Mauritius rum tasted as good as it smelled. Perhaps a little sharper, perhaps a little drier on the tongue than the aromas might have suggested, but it really was something of a low-yield fruit bomb. There were raspberries, there were strawberries, there was lemon peel, ginger, sherbet. They all were partying hard together with the deeper flavors of prunes, molasses, vanilla, nuts, chocolate mousse, ice cream, caramel. And that wasn't even the end of it. There was a touch of Coca-Cola, tobacco, seaweed like iodine, and so on. And there was even this kind of like really sly hint. Oh, it's still there. Of brine, thyme, mint, that rounded things off, and it transferred into a really smooth, silky finish dominated by candied oranges, a sharp line of citrus peel, and a very nice red wine component that completed what was and remains right now a really very good rum. It is like a curiously different Barbados rum, I would have to say, with aspects of Guyana and Jamaica thrown in for kick. But the fact is that it has a quality all of its own. And it hopefully allows the island of Mauritius to get more press in the years to come. And for sure, it is a rum to share around. I mean, I would drink this all day long. In fact, I have been drinking it all day long. This is really nice. All right. So what else is going on in the bar? Well, with some difficulty, I finally managed to catch Mrs. Kaner's eye and pass the glass over to her because I thought that this was something that she would enjoy. She actually does like this stuff, and she has a better nose than me, even though it's really kind of small. And somehow, even after all the daiquiris that she was getting, her eyes were clear, her speech was unslurred, unlike mine, her diction was flawless, and I may be biased, but I thought she looked absolutely lovely, as I still do to this day. And as she tried the SBS, this Mauritius rum, I could see from her expression that she appreciated its construction as well. And she complimented Joshua and Gregors on their selection. And she said, this is great. And then she provided me a whole bunch of detailed tasting notes, which I've conveniently lost and none of which have made it into this this review. Like I said, it was a fun time. You had to have been there. All right, so Nikolai in his corner was as happy to cast some other comments onto the table regarding his opinions of the rum, all of which were actually quite positive. And we all kind of agreed, right? It really is a good rum. And I told Gregors that this is one nice piece of work, which if I could buy, I would, except that I can't. So in the other corner, my wife, having delivered herself of her earth-shaking opinion and given me all these tasting notes, immediately beelined over to the bar area where, thank the Lord, Guillaume's fiancé and sister just arrived. And I guess that she had probably had enough of all the testosterone in our corner and wanted some real conversation with with people who were specifically not certifiable as rum as we were. All right, so I wanted some fresh air. So Joshua and I went outside. Yoshi was there as well, taking a smoke. And the irony does not escape me, so don't go there. The nighttime air of Paris was crisp. It was March weather. It was cool. It was nice. And I remember all the reasons why I liked coming here. And then we all kind of sat around and discussed 1423 and Nine Leaves and their philosophy, the humble beginnings all these years ago, which is too much for this essay. And other people have done their job on it already, so I didn't have to say anything else about it. Anyway, I remarked to Joshua that I thought that the Mauritius was a really good piece of work. And I was happy to have started off 2019 and this Rum Fest on a really good and tasty shot. So Josh, being who he is, courteously did not ask me for my score, which for some obscure reason is all that everybody seems to want and nothing else. And then I kind of just changed the subject and I said, well, what do you think I should try next? So he kind of smiled at me and he said, I swear to God, Joshua always reminds me of a Santa Claus in civilian clothing. When his hair goes white, the resemblance is just uncanny. Anyway, Santa Claus taking a breather from the gift giving, mingling with the common folk. And he said, oh God, yeah, the Jamaica for sure. I mean, that's a DOK, it's PX finished, pot still aged in 40-litre barrels. And let me tell you, there is something really interesting about that Jamaica, I gotta tell you. And I said, okay, stop. My fingers were twitching. I said, hang on. I got to write that down. Let me go inside. You can pour me a shot and you can tell me everything that I need to know while I try it. I don't want to miss a thing. And while that closing story is not really relevant to the Mauritius rum I'm supposed to be talking about here, that's pretty much what we ended up doing. In a really quiet and cool evening in the City of Lights, in a bar that was just hopping the entire night long, spent in the lively company of geeks, reps, writers, drinkers, bartenders, and simply really, really good friends. You can't ask for more than that, As a point of interest, I think I scored this rum about 87 points. I really think it deserved that. It remains a phenomenal piece of work. And I'm sorry I didn't buy a rum that day, but I couldn't. So just a bit of an epilogue, though, even though this is already going into 19 minutes. Guillaume Leblanc moved to Reunion Island, and he's working there now, as far as I recall. 1423 is having some financial difficulties, and Gregors no longer works there. There's some issues with staffing, and Joshua is kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the door or whatever. And unfortunately, the Maria Loca bar is closed, which is kind of a shame. All the other people that I've mentioned, I think, are well known enough to have their own biographies and everybody knows what they do. But you know what? It was such a wonderful, wonderful night. It remains one of the high points of my rum drinking experience. Not because the rum was phenomenal, though I think it is, but because, like with everything else, when you go to these rum fests, it's the people that matter. It is the friends you make. It's the parties you go to. You can't ask for more than that. That's it from me for today. Take care, everybody, and have a really, really good day. Bye-bye.